The factory floor was a graveyard of silence. The usual roar of machinery, the clanging of metal, and the rhythmic hum of the conveyor belt, the very heartbeat of the company, were gone. In their place was a silence so heavy that it felt like the walls themselves were holding their breath. Machines worth millions stood frozen, their blinking red and yellow lights flickering like cruel reminders of failure. To the exhausted engineers staring at them, those lights were no longer signals. They were mockery. They seemed to say, "You've tried everything and still I won't move." The giant conveyor belt, a machine that stretched the length of a football field, had always been the pride of the factory. It was the backbone of the assembly line, the artery through which every product flowed. Without it, the entire system was nothing but disconnected pieces of steel and bolts. And now, that backbone was broken. The conveyor refused to budge an inch. Without it, production wasn't just slowed, it was dead. Every passing hour meant thousands of dollars gone, evaporating like smoke. Every passing day pushed losses deeper into the millions. What had once been a thriving operation was quickly becoming a bleeding wound. Supervisors stormed across the factory floor, their voices sharp and impatient as they barked at the workers who had long since run out of energy to respond. Some stood hunched over blueprints, tracing and retracing lines with trembling fingers, trying to find a mistake that might unlock the problem. Others crowded around the machine itself, covered in grease, their eyes bloodshot from nights without sleep. Arguments erupted in every corner. One engineer insisted it was the sensors. Another swore the problem was the hydraulics. A third shouted that the system's software was corrupted beyond repair. Voices clashed louder than the machines ever had, but none of it mattered. Nothing worked. The CEO himself had abandoned the comfort of his glass office to pace the floor with the rest of them. Normally, he was a figure of control, polished suit, calm voice, and a commanding presence. But now, his tie hung loose around his neck, his shirt sleeves were rolled up, and beads of sweat glistened on his forehead. He moved from group to group, demanding answers he knew they didn't have. Every time an engineer began to explain their failed solution, his face tightened. The weight of the crisis pressed down on his shoulders. But heavier still was the knowledge of what failure would mean. The shareholders were already calling. Investors were nervous. If this conveyor didn't start soon, contract worth millions would be lost, clients would walk away, and the factory itself might not survive. They had tried everything. Sensors had been replaced twice, each time with newer, more expensive models. Entire wiring systems had been stripped and reinstalled. Programmers had worked until their eyes burned, running endless simulations on computers that whirred and overheated. When the local team couldn't crack the problem, specialists had been flown in from other states, men and women with reputations as miracle workers. But even they left defeated, shaking their heads, muttering that it didn't make sense. Machines like this didn't just stop. They weren't supposed to be puzzles that no one could solve. But here it was, the unsolvable puzzle, sitting in silence, mocking them. The factory, once filled with a steady hum of progress, now vibrated with something else. Fear. Every employee felt it in their chest, an invisible weight pressing down harder with each passing minute. The janitors who usually joked while sweeping stayed quiet. The workers who used a whistle while checking parts avoided eye contact. Even the cafeteria, once a noisy space filled with laughter and clattering trays, had gone still. No one felt like eating when the entire future of the company hung by a thread. And it wasn't just about the company. Everyone on that floor knew what was at stake. If the conveyor didn't move soon, contracts would collapse like dominoes. Once the clients pulled out, money would dry up. Once the money dried up, layoffs would follow. Hundreds of families, men, women, children, would feel the ripple of that failure. Mortgages would go unpaid. Kids would be pulled out of schools. Medical bills would pile up. A broken machine wasn't just steel and wiring. It was a potential destruction of a community. The pressure was unbearable. Some engineers snapped under it, slamming tools on the floor or burying their heads in their hands. Others doubled down, working with a kind of manic determination, convinced that if they just stared at the blueprints long enough, the answer would reveal itself. But the conveyor belt remained silent, immovable, indifferent to their struggle. There was a kind of cruel irony in it. This machine had once been celebrated with champagne when it was first installed. The CEO himself had cut a ribbon in front of the gleaming structure, smiling for cameras and shaking hands with politicians who praised it as a symbol of innovation and progress. It was meant to be the company's greatest investment, the machine that would take them into the future. And now, that same machine was dragging them to the edge of ruin. Late into the night, the factory lights stayed on, casting long shadows across the motionless conveyor. The air smelled of oil and sweat, thick and suffocating. No one wanted to admit it, but the truth whispered in every corner. They were running out of time. Every possible fix had failed. Every expert had walked away. And yet, tomorrow, investors would want answers, and the workers would still need paychecks. The future of the factory, the company, and everyone tied to it, all of it depended on that lifeless conveyor belt sparking back to life. And as the night wore on, that hope seemed to grow smaller, flickering like a dying light bulb in the silence of the factory graveyard. Amid all the shouting, the chaos, and the heavy silence of failure, the unexpected sound of squeaking brakes echoed outside the factory. A delivery truck rolled up to the loading bay, its headlights cutting through the gloom of dusk. No one looked up. No one cared. After all, what was one more delivery when the entire backbone of their operation was broken? The driver's door swung open, and out stepped a tall, lean man in a faded baseball cap, worn jeans, and scuffed work boots. His shirt clung to him with the sweat of a long day on the road. He wasn't an engineer. He wasn't a supervisor. He wasn't even on the company's payroll. To everyone on that floor, he was just another face, another delivery driver carrying boxes no one really wanted. He hefted 2 large crates of replacement parts in the truck and began the familiar walk across the plant. Normally, no one would have paid him much attention. But tonight, their indifference was sharper, colder. He was background noise in a room already drowning in tension. Supervisors were shouting at engineers. Engineers were arguing with each other. And somewhere in the middle of it all, the CEO was pacing like a caged animal, his eyes darting from one group to another, desperate for a miracle. No one noticed the driver's gaze shift. No one saw the way he slowed as he passed the lifeless conveyor belt. To most, it was just a hunk of steel and rubber lying in betrayal. But to him, it was something else entirely. He tilted his head, as if straining to hear a voice buried beneath the static of all the yelling around him. His eyes narrowed, not in confusion but in recognition. He wasn't listening to the men in suits or the engineers with clipboards. He was listening to the faint groans, the subtle creaks that came from deep inside the belly of the machine. And what he heard made his heart beat faster. To everyone else, the conveyor was dead. To him, it wasn't silent at all. It was crying. This driver wasn't just some random man with a truck. He carried with him a childhood soaked in grease and motor oil. His late father had been a factory worker, the kind of man who came home with hands blackened by machinery and a back bent by years of labor. While other kids played outside, he had grown up in the dim glow of garage lights, watching his father strip engines apart, patch up machines, and breathe life into things everyone else thought were finished. But his father didn't just teach him how to use a wrench. He taught him how to listen. Machines are like people, son, his father used to say, his rough hands guiding his small ones as they tightened bolts. They'll tell you what's wrong if you pay attention. Most folks only see metal and wires. But if you listen, really listen, you'll hear their language. That lesson had followed him through life. He never went to engineering school. He never earned fancy degrees or sat in conference rooms filled with blueprints. But he knew machines in his bones. For him, belts, gears, pistons, and motors weren't just inanimate objects. They were alive, in their own way. They spoke in rattles, hums, vibrations, and groans. And tonight, standing in that factory full of supposed experts, he could hear the conveyor belt loud and clear. It wasn't just broken. It was screaming for help. The driver set the crates down with a heavy thud, but he didn't walk away. His eyes stayed fixed on the machine. Every instinct in him pulled closer. He noticed the subtle sag in the belt, the faint discoloration along the rollers, the way one of the joints seemed slightly out of rhythm. These weren't things most people would catch, not even engineers buried in numbers and diagrams. But to him, It was as obvious as a limp in someone's step. For a long moment, he stood there lost in thought. The noise of the factory faded. The shouting voices became distant echoes. All he could hear was a machine, whispering its pain. His mind raced with the knowledge passed down from his father. The tiny clues, the overlooked details, the way one small misalignment could cripple an entire system. He couldn't shake the thought, I know what's wrong. And yet, who was he to speak? He was just a driver, a man whose name no one bothered to learn. 15 engineers had already failed. Specialists had flown in and walked away, defeated. What chance did a delivery guy have? If he said something, they'd laugh. Worse, they'd get angry. This was a place of titles and degrees, of authority and rank, and he had none of it. Still, he couldn't look away. He couldn't silence the voice of the conveyor in his head. Machines didn't lie, and this one was practically shouting the truth. He clenched his jaw, torn between stepping back into a shadow or stepping forward into a storm that could change everything. The irony wasn't lost on him. His whole life, people had underestimated him. Teachers dismissed him. Employers overlooked him. To most, he was just the guy who delivers things. But standing there in that factory filled with failure, he realized he might be the only one who actually understood what the machine was saying. He adjusted his cap, wiped the sweat from his brow, and took a slow breath. Deep down, he knew his father wouldn't have hesitated. His father would have walked right up to that conveyor, grease-stained hands and all, and dared anyone to stop him. And in that moment, the driver made a choice. He wasn't going to stay silent, because sometimes the right person in the wrong place isn't a miracle. It's exactly what the situation demands. The delivery driver wiped his hands on his jeans, squared his shoulders, and finally stepped away from the shadows. He walked toward the cluster of engineers huddled around their blueprints and blinking monitors. Their faces were drawn tight, their eyes hollow from lack of sleep, their pride bruised by failure. Still, they carried themselves with an air of superiority, as though their degrees and years of training formed a shield against doubt. The driver cleared his throat. His voice wasn't loud, but it cut through the noise of the factory floor like a blade. "Excuse me," he said calmly, his tone steady. "I think I might know what's wrong with your conveyor." The words hung in the air. For a moment, there was silence. Stunned silence. Heads turned. Engineers froze mid-argument. Even the pacing CEO stopped in his tracks. Then, just as quickly, the silence shattered into laughter. One engineer slapped his knee, shaking his head as if he'd just heard the funniest joke of his life. Another leaned against the machine, smirking with condescension. A third actually pointed at the driver, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "Really? You? You think you can fix what 15 of us couldn't? 15 engineers with degrees, certifications, and years of training? You, what? Deliver packages and think that qualifies you to fix multi-million-dollar machinery." The others chuckled, some outright laughing, some just shaking their heads in disbelief. To them, it was absurd, offensive, even. The audacity of a delivery driver daring to speak in the middle of their battlefield of failure. Another engineer chimed in, his voice sharp with irritation. "Stick to deliveries, man. Drop your boxes and move along. This is way, way out of your league." The driver stood quietly, letting their ridicule wash over him like rain. He didn't flinch. He didn't argue. He didn't snap back or shrink away. Instead, his eyes remained steady, calm, unshaken. It was the same calmness that had carried him through years of being underestimated. The same calmness his father once wore in the face of foremen who doubted him. When the laughter faded, he spoke again, his voice firm but not loud. "I'm not here to take your jobs or prove you wrong. All I'm saying is, give me 10 minutes with the machine. If I fail, I'll walk away, no questions asked. But if I'm right," he paused, letting the weight of his words settle. "If I'm right, you'll save millions today." His words cut deeper than the engineers expected. They glanced at each other, some still smirking, others frowning. Pride was a heavy thing. They'd worked for weeks without success, poured every ounce of knowledge into this machine, only to be told that maybe, just maybe, a delivery driver could do what they couldn't. It stung. The CEO, however, didn't laugh. He studied the driver closely, his eyes narrowing. He had every reason to dismiss this man. On paper, he was nobody, no degree, no title, no reputation. But the CEO had been watching, even if no one else had. He saw the way the driver had looked at the conveyor earlier, as if it were more than just a pile of broken machinery. He noticed the way his expression carried no arrogance, no cockiness, just quiet confidence. And in that confidence, the CEO recognized something. Desperation had a way of sharpening a man's instincts, and right now, instincts were all they had left. The CEO rubbed his temples, then exhaled a long, tired sigh. The factory had been at a standstill for weeks. Investors were pulling at his collar. The board was demanding answers he couldn't give. He had already thrown money at specialists who had delivered nothing but excuses. What did he really have to lose? Finally, he spoke. His voice was weary, but it carried authority. Fine, you've got 10 minutes. Gasps rippled through the engineers. Some protested immediately. Sir, you can't be serious. This is insane, letting some random delivery guy touch the equipment. What if he makes it worse? But the CEO cut them off with a sharp wave of his hand. Enough. He's got 10 minutes. Everyone step back. The engineers grumbled, folding their arms, some rolling their eyes, others muttering under their breath. They stepped aside reluctantly, their pride smarting, their skepticism written all over their faces. To them, this was a waste of time, a desperate gamble by a desperate man. But to the driver, it was a chance. As he stepped forward, the silence of the factory grew thick again. The workers who had been pretending not to listen were now watching closely, curiosity flickering in their tired eyes. The janitors paused mid-sweep. Even the cafeteria staff peered in from the doorway. Everyone knew the stakes. Everyone knew this machine was the difference between survival and collapse. And now, against all odds, the fate of the factory rested not on the shoulders of men with titles and degrees, but on a quiet delivery driver who had asked for nothing more than 10 minutes. He adjusted his cap, rolled up his sleeves, and placed his hand on the cold steel of the conveyor. For the first time in weeks, the machine wasn't surrounded by noise, by shouting, by frantic debates. It was surrounded by silence. And in that silence, the driver listened. 10 minutes. That was all he had. But sometimes, 10 minutes is all it takes for the world to turn upside down. The driver rolled up his sleeves slowly, the grease-stained fabric clinging to his forearms. Every eye in the factory followed him now. The laughter from earlier had vanished, replaced by tense silence and hushed whispers. No one dared to speak too loudly, as if any sound might break the fragile thread of hope dangling in the air. He didn't rush toward the gleaming computer systems. He didn't reach for the tablets or the sophisticated diagnostic equipment stacked on tables. He ignored the brand-new sensors that had cost the company a fortune, the ones that engineers had spent weeks replacing and recalibrating. Instead, he crouched low, lowering himself to the level of the machine, as though greeting an old friend. He tapped the conveyor's frame with the back of his knuckles. Clink, clink. Each hollow vibration told him a story. His callous fingers traced the length of the belt, brushing against grease stains and worn grooves that only someone who had listened to machines all his life would notice. His eyes narrowed as they followed the rollers, scanning every joint, every connection, every place where steel met steel. The engineers exchanged looks, some smirking again, though more nervously this time. "What's he even doing?" one whispered. "He's tapping it." Another muttered, baffled. "This is ridiculous." A third scoffed. But the driver wasn't listening to them. He wasn't here for their approval. He was here for the machine. Then he saw it. It wasn't dramatic, not at first glance. Just a tiny misalignment in the belt, barely a fraction of an inch off. Too small for the complex diagnostics to catch. Too subtle for computer models to flag. But for a man who'd been raised in the language of machines, it was as obvious as a crooked picture frame on a wall. The engineers' endless adjustments, their frantic tinkering, their constant recalibrations, they had only made it worse. They had been treating symptoms, not the illness. The machine didn't need another round of expensive software updates or sensor replacements. It didn't need specialists flown in from across the country. It needed something far simpler, a small recalibration. And one overlooked bolt tighten in the right place. The driver stood up, dusted off his hands, and walked calmly toward the loading bay. He disappeared into his truck for a moment, returning not with sleek tools or advanced instruments, but with a single old wrench, the same kind of tool his father had taught him to use as a boy. Its handle was scratched, its edges worn down by years of work, but in his hands, it was more powerful than all the fancy equipment surrounding him. The room grew even quieter. The CEO gripped his clipboard so tightly his knuckles turned white. Workers held their breath, watching as the driver crouched again by the conveyor. With deliberate care, he fit the wrench onto the bolt. His movements were steady, sure, almost graceful in their simplicity. Click, turn, tighten. He adjusted the alignment manually, shifting the belt until it sat just where it was supposed to. Then, with one final twist, he locked it into place. For a second, nothing happened. The driver placed his palm gently against the belt, almost like he was reassuring it. Then, with a slow, deliberate push, he set it into motion. The factory held its collective breath. And then, whir. It was faint at first, like a whisper. A low groan rolled to the machine, vibrating along the frame. Then it grew louder, stronger, until it wasn't a groan anymore. It was a roar. The conveyor jolted, shuddered, and then, with a triumphant surge, it came back to life. The belt moved, smoothly, effortlessly, as if nothing had ever been wrong. For a moment, no one moved. No one spoke. The sound of the conveyor echoed across the factory floor like the heartbeat of a giant waking from a long slumber. Engineers stood frozen, their mouths slightly open, unable to believe what they were seeing. The CEO's clipboard slipped from his hands and clattered onto the concrete floor. And then, gasps rippled through the room. A worker clapped his hands over his mouth. Another let out a shout of pure disbelief. And then, like a dam breaking, the silence shattered into chaos. Did you see that? No way that just worked. He fixed it. He actually fixed it. The workers erupted into cheers, clapping, stomping, shouting. Some even jumped up and down, their weeks of bottled frustration exploding into raw celebration. For the first time in what felt like forever, the factory wasn't filled with despair. It was filled with hope, roaring louder than the conveyor itself. The driver stepped back slowly, dusting his hands off like it was nothing. No dramatic speeches. No victory pose. Just quiet satisfaction. To him, it was simple. A machine had cried for help, and he had answered. But to everyone else in that factory, it was nothing short of a miracle. The CEO pressed his palms against his forehead, his chest heaving as if he had just run a marathon. Relief and disbelief battled across his face. He looked at the driver like he was seeing him for the first time. This wasn't just a man in a faded cap and work boots. This was the man who had just saved his company from collapse, saved his workers from layoffs, saved contracts worth millions. One of the engineers, still in shock, muttered under his breath, "It was just a bolt, just a misalignment." He trailed off, shaking his head, unable to process how something so simple could have escaped them all. Pride stung, but even pride couldn't drown out the truth standing right in front of them. The driver, unfazed by the stares, simply reached for his wrench, wiped on a rag, and tucked it back under his arm. To him, this wasn't about glory. It wasn't about proving anyone wrong. It was about doing what needed to be done. And as the conveyor roared on, carrying the weight of the factory's future, every single person there knew they had just witnessed something extraordinary. The CEO was the first to move. He rushed forward, his polished shoes clicking loudly on the concrete as he pushed through the stunned crowd. His face, usually a mask of control, was alive with shock and raw relief. He reached out, almost grabbing the driver's arm as if afraid he might vanish before he could get an answer. "How?" His voice cracked, uncharacteristically unsteady. "How did you do that? We spent weeks on this. We brought in the best minds, the most expensive specialists. We replaced sensors, parts, entire systems. And you fix it in 10 minutes. The factory floor grew quiet again, all eyes fixed on the driver. The same people who had laughed at him, mocked him, and brushed him aside were now staring in awe, waiting to hear his explanation. The driver adjusted his faded cap, his expression calm, almost gentle. He wasn't gloating. He wasn't basking in their stunned admiration. Instead, he gave a small, humble smile. Sometimes, he said softly, machines don't need complicated solutions. You just have to listen. The simplicity of his words cut through the air like lightning. No arrogance, no lectures, just truth. For a moment, silence lingered once more, but this time it wasn't filled with doubt or mockery. It was filled with respect. Genuine, bone-deep respect. And then, like a wave breaking, the room erupted into applause. The sound thundered through the factory. Workers clapped until their palms stung. Some whistled. Others cheered, their voices echoing against the steel walls. The same engineers who had rolled their eyes earlier now looked at the driver with admiration, their pride swallowed by the undeniable reality of what he had done. A few of them even stepped forward, nodding silently, acknowledging that he had seen what they couldn't. The CEO gripped the driver's hand firmly, shaking it with a strength that carried both gratitude and disbelief. His eyes burned with sincerity as he said, "You're smarter than any engineer I've ever met. You just saved this company, this factory, and every job in it. We need someone like you on our team. Name your price." The room buzzed at his words. The idea of a delivery driver, this quiet, unassuming man, being offered a seat at the table stunned them all. Some thought he would leap at the chance. After all, wasn't this a dream? Recognition, wealth, status? But the driver only gave another small smile, shaking his head slowly. "I'm just here to deliver parts," he said. His voice was steady, unshaken by the magnitude of the offer. "My dad always told me, fixing something isn't about titles or degrees. It's about paying attention. It's about respect. Machines talk, if you care enough to listen. People do too." There was a weight to his words that settled over everyone like a blanket. The applause faded into quiet reflection. Men and women who had scoffed at him hours ago now stood with bowed heads, realizing the depth of what he just said. It wasn't just about fixing a conveyor belt. It was about life, about humility, about how brilliance doesn't always come with a title or a degree. Sometimes it comes from a man in work boots and a faded cap, carrying wisdom passed down from a father's hands. The driver picked up his ragged wrench, tucked it back under his arm, and reached for his cap. He gave the CEO a respectful nod, then turned toward the exit. No victory lap, no speech, no demand for recognition. Just a quiet man who had done his job, and more, and was ready to move on. The workers parted for him as he walked, their eyes following him with awe. Some clapped him on the shoulder, whispering, "Thank you," as he passed. Others simply stared, their faces reflecting the humbling realization that they had underestimated him. The factory door swung open, and the driver stepped out into the fading light of evening. The hum of the conveyor carried on behind him, steady and strong, as though nothing had ever been wrong. But everyone inside knew better. They knew that everything had changed in those 10 minutes. The CEO stood in the doorway, watching the driver disappear into the glow of the setting sun. He shook his head, a small smile tugging at his lips. "Genius," he murmured, "can come from anywhere." And it was true. That day, the factory learned a lesson they would never forget. Engineers who had once thought their degrees made them untouchable walked away humbled, reminded that knowledge without humility is blind. Supervisors who barked orders realized the value of listening, not just to people, but to the machines they work with daily. The CEO, once consumed with investors and contracts, rediscovered the heartbeat of his company. The people, their stories, their hidden brilliance. Most importantly, the workers, the men and women whose jobs had hung in the balance, walked away with renewed hope. They talked about the driver for days, weeks, even months. His story spread beyond the walls of the factory, whispered in break rooms, retold at dinner tables, shared as a reminder whenever doubt crept in. "Remember the delivery guy?" They'd say, "The one who fixed a conveyor in 10 minutes when no one else could." It became more than a story. It became a legend, a symbol of humility, of paying attention, of believing that greatness can live in the most unexpected places. And the driver? He didn't chase fame. He didn't return to demand a job or money. He went back to his routes, delivering packages, carrying crates, living the quiet life he had always known. But wherever he went, People looked at him differently now. They saw more than a delivery man. They saw a reminder that sometimes the answers we search for in complexity can be found in simplicity. The conveyor belt hummed on, stronger than ever, not just as a machine, but as a monument to the lesson learned that day. Genius doesn't always wear a suit. It doesn't always hold a degree. Sometimes it walks into the loading bay, wearing work boots, carrying a wrench, and reminding the world that brilliance can come from anywhere. And that lesson, etched into the hearts of everyone in that factory, would never fade